Dan asked me to just update everybody on an ongoing activity we're doing. We're looking at identifying what we're calling leading practices for use of climate projections for community resilience planning. And I think many of you know that NIST about 10 years ago almost now published the Community Resilience Planning Guide for buildings and infrastructure systems. It does focus on the built environment, but it also brings into context the social impacts and economic impacts that occur with decisions that are made. And I think the big distinction, as Dan just said, is that by getting that community scale, it helps us better understand the performance that's required from individual systems, buildings, or planned projects. So we've had a series of 3 workshops, and I listed them all on this front slide here. They occurred between November and January, and we selected 3 areas to focus on, basically coastal flooding, inland flooding, and wildfire, because these are the areas that we're hearing the most from communities in terms of asking for assistance and guidance in their planning for the future. And this was an effort between NIST, NOAA, and ASCE, trying to bring together our collective expertise, connections, and the needs that each of us bring to the table. And there's a link here at the bottom. If you just put in community resilience, codes, and climate at NIST, I think the page will pop up. But we have our workshops documented there. So just to give you a sense for the purpose of the workshops, we wanted to identify leading practices. And what we mean by this is we're acknowledging that the science is not fully, I think, adopted from a consensus point of view about how it would be applied in planning, design, codes, and standards, at least across the US. And so that led us to say, well, let's take a look at what communities are doing now, because they've been doing work, some of them for 10 years now, in climate resilience. And they have made decisions about how they're going to use data, what data they're going to use. And we were hoping to identify some commonalities between those to guide this goal of this group and helping communities in their planning. And so the purpose of this is to update our community resilience planning guide, to add a section that is guidance about how to identify the type of science that might be considered, what the pros and cons are, and then what some case studies or examples are, because communities really like to build off of each other's work where possible. And so the objectives then were to explore case studies of leading practices, to help us understand how climate change projections are being used in infrastructure planning, and then to document these lessons for using climate information. And I'm not going to focus on it today, but where possible, we also tried to explore the topic of how planning is addressing justice and equity issues as part of this climate work. So the primary audience that we had in mind for these are the practitioners who are involved in development of design guidelines, and eventually we hope to support codes and standards work. This includes, but is not limited to, infrastructure designers and engineers, climate scientists, and decision makers or officials with oversight of infrastructure systems. So just to help you understand how we came up with our case studies, we have our criteria listed on the left. We wanted to work with communities that had been in this space for a while. So they had a published plan or guidance. They had specific hazards that they were focusing on and had been developing this guidance for. There was some consideration of community perspectives and equity principles. And as we all know, it helped if they had recently experienced an extreme event, because that tends to really motivate the not only planning but the implementation activities. And then also keeping an eye out for areas where the focus on the hazard is because the hazard is increasing or, as said here, worsening compared to what it's been in the past. So to address these case studies, we had a set of panelists for each workshop, and I'm just going to give you kind of the high-level overview here. So the first one on sea level rise and coastal storm surge. We had New York, San Francisco, Broward County down in Florida, and then Utah State University. And so Suzanne DeRoche, who's the Vice President for Clean and Resilient Buildings as part of the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, gave an overview of how they're addressing climate resilience and the design guidelines that they've developed in New York State. And David Bihar is the Climate Program Director for San Francisco Public Utilities, and talked about a lot of the exploration of science that they've done for sea level rise and leading practices for use of those climate projections. And I will say that if you go and look at his presentation, because I don't have time to go into great detail today, he documented some very interesting, I think, series of slides that look at how the science changes over time. And I'm not criticizing, scientists recognizing maybe a model needed to be adjusted, maybe a data was reinterpreted. But as a designer, if you see trends going up and then going down and then going up and then going down, it really starts to create this atmosphere of doubt when they're going to adopt these types of things. And he spoke quite well to that, I thought. Jennifer Gerardo is the Chief Resilience Officer in Broward County, and she has been working in this space for a number of years, and stepped through how Broward County is addressing sea level rise projections and flooding for resilience planning in Southeast Florida. And just for your awareness, even though she's the Chief Resilience Officer for Broward County, there are 5 counties in Southeast Florida that work together and have agreed to use the same climate data that comes from every 5 years, they have a Southeast Climate Committee that comes together to review the latest data and give them updated projections. And then at the end, we had Daniela Hirschfield from Utah State University, and she gave a broader perspective about adapting coastal environments to sea level rise. And then our second workshop was on precipitation and inland flooding. And again, we had 4 speakers. So we had Art DiGaetano from Cornell University, and he was speaking to the science behind determining future rainfall extremes, looking at the global climate models and how to interpret those. We also had from Boulder County, Stacy Proctor, who's a transportation manager, and talking about the steps that they're taking to prepare their infrastructure for future flooding scenarios. Tuskegee and Bessie is from the Philadelphia Water Department, an environmental engineer, and she too stepped through the decisions and the steps that they've made for incorporating precipitation projections as part of their water system planning. And then we had Jonathan Butcher, who's from Tetra Tech. He has done a lot of work with NOAA and was talking about the hydrology associated, a lot of the stormwater management and things like that associated with rain-driven inland flooding. And then we had our third workshop, which was a pretty significant changing gears, actually, moving from water-driven hazards to wildfire and wildland-urban interface events. And so we started out with Kelly Pohl from Headwaters Economics. This is a firm that works with a number of communities, and she gave a very nice presentation about a number of tools that are being developed to help with wildfire resilience. And then we had a co-presentation for the City of Austin, Justice Jones, who's the Climate Resilience and Adaptation Manager, and Mark Couder, who's the Wildfire Mitigation Officer, talking about the number of steps they're taking in Austin, Texas, that accommodates the city's growth, zoning, educating the public, working with various jurisdictions in the area, a lot of the planning aspects, in addition to focusing on not only current wildfire, but what the future wildfire impacts might look like. And we also had a presentation from Chris Chambers, the Chief of Fire and Rescue for the City of Ashland, Oregon. And he went through a parallel discussion with Ashland, Oregon, but given that it's in a different location with different challenges, it emphasized, the activities that they're taking there. And then we were very pleased to have Dave Sapsis from CAL FIRE. So he spoke at the state level for California. They're leaders in this space across our country, and how they're looking at climate resilience for communities. And I think the big takeaway from wildfire was the emphasis is primarily on mitigation. And we've all seen the news. If you get a wildfire sweeping across the community, recovery looks very different than it does from flooding or wind events. And so there's a very strong focus on one, how do we prevent the spread? And then two, how do we predict new areas that are subject to wildfire that previously weren't planning for wildfire because it wasn't an issue previously? Okay, and I think this is my last slide. After the presentations, we had a series of breakouts. And all of our panelists joined us, and they brought in other experts from their either areas or communities. And the participants joined those discussions as well. And this is just an example. We're writing a report that'll document the findings from the workshops. That's probably going to be ready, say, in May to be published. But I think a lot of this will look familiar to you. What we heard strongly, challenges were communication and engagement with stakeholders, coordinating across multiple entities because of siloed departments or government different jurisdictions or governments with varied approaches, and then individual owners of properties having very different ideas about what should or could be done. part of this is conveying the changing risk and benefits of climate resilience planning, as well as from a community perspective, finding ways to integrate built and nature-based systems for improved community performance for future events. So some of the broad needs that were identified, and we'll try to, underneath of these, identify some of those leading practices, were design guidance for methods, data, roles, and responsibility, guidance for selecting climate projections, and you can see the list here. There's a lot of work. There's all these issues that we've all talked about: timeline scenarios, temporal and spatial scales, interdependencies, uncertainty, varying degrees of risk aversion, quality of downscaled data for regional work, and associated consensus and consistency in those downscaled projections. And then acknowledging that depending on the need, all application, one data set is not necessarily suitable for all applications. And this really became apparent when we talked about the rainfall intensity, duration, and frequency curves. And then also communicating uncertainty for future performance and benefits is very challenging right now, as well as communicating well the strength and weaknesses of various climate models, whether they're global or regional, for different applications. And I think that was it. Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Terri. I appreciate it. That was helpful. If you, does anybody have any questions for Terri? Just raise your hand. That way I can see you. Any questions? I guess I'll go ahead, Bilal. Thank you.
No, I have, it's not a question, but a comment. Thank you so much, Terri. I mean, I've been working with NIST, with the Applied Economics Office, just to maybe put a plug in here because it might interest the group on the including risk aversion in the economics of mitigation and focusing on wildfire. So I'm going to put a couple of links with, if that's all right, about the new paper just came out last week. So I'm very excited about it. And it's with two key researchers at NIST. So thank you for your report.
Oh, well, thank you, Bilal. If you could put the link to your paper in the chat, that would be great.
Actually, I put the NIST link to about the paper.
So. Oh, great. Okay, thank you.
Other questions? All right, well, then I guess I'm going to kind of lean in here a little bit. Obviously, Terri, this looking at these issues at a community basis makes a tremendous amount of sense. It's a great complement to the more building and a system approach that most of the ASCE standards focuses on. So I see that there's a great deal of complementarity there. Looking at your list of needs that came out of these workshops, it's very, very reminiscent of, I would say, probably the majority of the conversations that we've been having. Obviously ASCE is working hard to try to provide design guidance. I think that some of the leadership that's being exerted through ASCE 7, that future conditions chapter 36 that's chaired by Abby Lyle, is facing a lot of these questions kind of head on. The question that I have is, do these workshops, I mean, do you intend, how do you operationalize, or how do you envision operationalizing the content that you're gleaning here? Is NIST considering changing some of its external funding opportunities? I mean, this is a great list of needs, but I could probably, I don't want to sound glib, but you could have done these workshops 5 years ago and you probably would have gotten a similar list of needs. So the question is, how do we make progress? I mean, I think traditionally, having been in this space now for 20 years, it seems like we're just kind of counting on osmosis. You know, we got a few bright people that come up with a better mousetrap, a better way of doing something, and then we just kind of socialize that until it gets picked up. And I'm not sure that really is going to help us get where we need to be in a rapid time frame. So obviously, I'm thinking of institutions like ASCE. You know, how does ASCE pick up the ball and move it forward, doing a lot of that kind of analysis and thinking for its members? You know, is there something we should be doing different?
Yeah, so that was a long question. I'm going to try to answer.
Yeah, sorry, there's a pony.
A number of points. One is, what we saw clearly is, even though this is being done at a regional or community scale, they were developing guidance for individual projects. So that in and of itself, I think, will be helpful. I did not want to try to list the specifics here because we're still in the process of going through all that. So I don't want to put forth something now that would be maybe somewhat modified later. We're in the process of doing that.
Okay, excellent.
This is going to inform, it's going to come out in the Community's Resilience Planning Guide, and we're also looking at writing a journal paper, you know, to help disseminate this, I think, before the Community Resilience Planning Guide will be completed. And so part of this knowledge, the leading practices we've identified, as soon as we get the report that summarizes the workshop and the findings from it, we can share that, right, with whoever wants to use it. I mean, it'll be broadly available to whoever wants to use it. As in terms of funding, you know, NIST has never been NOAA. Since NOAA's my sister agency is on the line, NOAA has a lot of money to send out the door. NIST does not. We have some funding available, but that our work is primarily done through collaboration, like we've done with these workshops, working directly with the codes and standards. And, you know, we do some research and contracts, but we just don't have the funds to put out broad announcements and, you know, send lots of money out the door.
Right. Okay. No, that sounds great. And I'm going to go to Norma Jean, and then I guess Chris Clavin has his hand up too. So Norma Jean.
Okay.
Thank you, Dan. So Terri, my question, because I don't think we have anything within standards for wildfires, but wildfires, that's a good percentage of our $1 billion disasters that we're seeing come up every 2 weeks now. So how do you think ASCE can help in maybe its guidelines and mitigation for that type of hazard? What are your thoughts? What did you glean from this workshop and from your work, and also your work with ASCE in attacking that type of hazard?
Right, it's a great question, because I think it is challenging, right, for those of us that focus on the built environment, to understand how to be more resistant to wildfire. But that being said, I think a lot of it will come from what I'm going to call the building envelope or cladding, because that's often how a house is initially either between that and the vegetation around them, how they get involved in the fires. So we won't be able to do perhaps, you know, the part that looks at the vegetation and maintenance of that. But I will say, for instance, after the Maui fires, As much as we all love energy efficiency, some of the solar panels that were being used, they were worried about maybe they were going to have to consider that as hazardous waste after the fire event. It wasn't simply just a matter of, having lost materials that you could then go put into a landfill. So there probably are some questions that need to be addressed, but I think it's going to be more on the building envelope side rather than the, say, structural framing side.
All right, thanks, Terry. Chris, and then Doug.
Hey, Terry. First, thank you for carrying this through. This crazy idea we had to hold these workshops through while I've been over your own being. It's great to see they're happening. Thank you. Okay, so my questions about, and Terry, you and I have talked about this before a little bit. I'm curious what you heard from the workshops. Is about like information requirements for like vulnerability assessments, risk assessments versus like design like level information requirements. So I'll caveat this with a lot of the work I'm working on with some other components over here at the White House with agencies. We're doing climate adaptation plans, OSTP, and the U.S. Global Change Research Program. This is all internal to the government. Well, rather, they're public. These are public guidelines internally for us and the government, but it's not for design requirements. Essentially, it's addressing some of the needs here on Terry on your slide about like what time frame should you pick versus for like risk tolerance, what like multiple epochs you should pick as well too. But again, that's just for like risk assessment to a range of different assets that the federal government owns. I'm curious, did any of the speakers in the different workshops get down to the level where they were actually trying to write or issue like design guidelines?
Yes.
Were they even getting down to that level? They were. So yeah. Can you talk about like who was doing that and how do they do it?
I think, New York State is probably well along that path. They definitely have design guidelines available for that. I don't think they're as broadly disseminated, but the Southeast Florida, Broward County, they clearly have identified criteria that they're using to evaluate projects. I'm just trying to think. San Francisco, I think has, I mean, one of the criteria we had for all the communities was that they have a published plans and or guidance for how they're going to address climate. Climate resilience is a phrase they often use, right? So, that's something that was a starting point, and then that's why we had the presentations to learn the details. But there's a fair amount of information to pull from those and synthesize.
All right, thanks. All right, then I've got Doug, and then Joe, you get the last word so that we can move on to this next discussion. So Doug?
Terry, thanks so much. This is super interesting. I guess one follow-up is I'm particularly interested in the last of the challenges you mentioned there, integrating the built and natural systems for performance. I really like the word performance there if you're trying to decide what to do. Maybe as a follow-up conversation, I would love to follow up with you or others on this call that might be interested to just dive a little bit deeper in terms of opportunities that are holding us back the most or to scale up. So maybe just as a follow-up. And in the needs, I realize that they're awfully related and thorny, but I think, and many of you are the experts in this, not myself, but I'm certainly seeing how climate data is being used in ways that if you really understood the uncertainties is beyond the envelope of the reasonable. I've heard about regulatory challenges where different agencies are using different sea level projections and things like that. So it's a really tricky question. I am curious if there's maybe a follow-up conversation on in 2024, what are the best opportunities to kind of get at that collection of making it easier to connect a particular application and the best federal data available? Because I know many organizations are now going to like First Street and other sources, but if we're going to leverage federal data, how can we make it easier to ensure that that connection is is the soundest based on the science and the needs. And that's a huge thing, but I'd be curious at a follow-up conversation if there are certain things beyond what's already been going on that we might do to advance that. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug.
Sure, yeah.
And then Joe?
I just, one of my roles, I think, on this is thinking about the communication of climate science and trying to simplify or at least communicate more clearly the relative risks and things like that. And, I guess I'm a little concerned when you mentioned David Behar's presentation about, sort of the whiplash in terms of climate projections kind of sowing doubt. Where can I find that presentation? And
So, yeah, it's here. I'll put it in the chat.
Thank you, Terry.
Yeah,
some of the others I'd be interested in
that.
going through as well. And I mean, one thing that's coming forward, in SEI chose to use a 3°C global warming level world as a sort of
Yes.
guiding principle, which does simplify a lot of the climate communication. But we're working through a lot of the implications, I think, in those committees as to what that actually means, how that's implemented. But there are opportunities, I think, here now, given what we've learned in the last 15 or 20 years of doing this, to streamline the process, I think, still making it consistent with what people have done, in the past. And that's really where this is kind of exciting to see what people are actually doing on the ground. So I'm really looking forward to your reports.
Yeah, my one thought is I did not see the ASCE SEI approach to establishing a 3 degrees Celsius criterion as part of their guidance anywhere else. And I understand why that's being done, but that is a little bit different from what the communities are doing. They're working with the scenarios and selecting, for instance, the highest RCP 8.5 for what they call critical infrastructure, those above a certain dollar amount, or those that would be what we would call risk category 4. And then they use different ones for smaller projects, either in terms of financed amount or their risk category. And from a community perspective, I think that bears thinking about.
Well, and to make these consistent, because it really is just a different organization of the data. And it's something that climate scientists themselves have come to in the last 5 or so years as a sort of a simpler way to even just simplify the projections for our own science. So it's definitely moving forward and shifting, but I'm hoping we can continue that conversation and make sure that those who've done it the other way know that it's really not inconsistent. It's just a slightly different way of looking at things.
Excellent.